Welcome to Digication Scholars Conversations. I'm your host, Jeff Yan. In this episode, you'll hear part 2 of my conversation with Devon Thomas Jones and Thomas Murray from University of Arizona. Devon and Tom are course directors for University 301 General Education ePortfolio, University 101 Introduction to the General Education Experience, respectively. They are also both associate professors of practice at the W.A. Franke Honors College in the Office of General Education. More links and information about today's conversation can be found on Digication's Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Full episodes of Digication Scholars Conversations can be found on YouTube or your favorite podcast app. I'm a huge fan of the reform that's centered around reflection. I think that it is clearly, to me, one of those things where when we earlier on we're talking about the durable skills, the transferable skills. Reflection is probably the linchpin that puts all of this together. And that I think, Tom, you were saying that for 12 years prior to this, professionally as students, they weren't ever asked about what they are curious about. I bet you they weren't being really asked really on reflecting on anything of their own experience either, right? And it's just it's almost like one of those things that um, most people in the world won't deny almost naturally that, yeah, it's a good part, it's an important part of learning, yet we don't carve out time and space in our curriculum, in our day-to-day, to have students do this reflection. And I don't even think that it's reflection is that kind of like, some people think of it as, well, there's that too touchy-feely thing, I'm going to meditate, and it's not even that. It's, really we're talking about like you layering your own experience, making connections so that you can come with a strategy and how to solve a problem. These are things that scientists do, artists do, dancers do, nurses do. You have to do it constantly, every day, all the time. And so it's almost like, it feels almost like one of those skills that we just forgot that it was so important. It's so important, but we forgot about it. And I think that what you are all doing, bringing that to be such a focus, is incredibly important work in your reform.
I mean, if you want to be excellent in your field, reflection is how you do that, right? I mean, when I was in high school and I played football, what did we do every Monday? We watched a videotape on VHS,
Mm.
videotape of our football game for that weekend, right? And our coaches made us look at the okay, what what did you do well? What did you do poorly? What do you need to do better next time, right? That is how you get better at playing football. That's how you get better at anything. If you want to be a great engineer, you need to reflect on the engineering that you've done and how do you make it better. And I think what people forget about is that reflection. Yes, is there something about being human that makes reflection somewhat natural? Perhaps, but it's a skill, right? It's like any other skill. The more you do it, the more intentional you are, the more practice you have, the better you get. Um,
Right.
and if you want to be the best of the best, that's how you're going to get there.
And that allows our brains then, right, to recall experiences and apply them in new contexts. And that's ultimately what we're hoping students can do with what they've learned and spent many years dedicating time and energy in the classroom to having these spaces where they can practice these different skills and apply them to course specific or case scenarios. And then when they're out in their fields and industries, they're able to better make those connections and to build in that time and intentionality around purposeful reflection and to facilitate is really part of the learning process and ultimately what students should be able to take with them so that they can say, oh yeah, I actually got something out of my degree because now I can see how I've applied some of the things I've learned. Sometimes I think it's easy to assume that, like, when we ask students, right, like, what are you curious about? And to carve out that time to sit, one feels almost indulgent, right? In a world where there's so many taps on our time. And instead, like that shouldn't be an indulgent activity. That requires work. And sometimes it uncovers things about ourselves that maybe we don't necessarily want to deal with quite yet, or right, or sometimes through that process students come to realize, wow, maybe I'm picking a degree path that is not right for me, and how do I grapple with that, right? Those are tough questions, and that's, as you mentioned, hard work to work through. But it shouldn't be indulgent. That time shouldn't be reserved for the few. Like in their like small liberal arts on the grassy knoll, whatever this like time of whatever we thought college was supposed to be like. But it actually should be embedded and time preserved in the curriculum because it is an essential part of the learning process.
Yeah, I love that because I think that it's I mean, you were saying that maybe humans that naturally have that reflection, but but if but then why are we not making that something that we value, like from day one? Why aren't we saying, well, yeah, we are naturally good at this, let's harness this? So that we don't do that very well in the past. In the past, it's been, well, actually, you're going to figure that out because you're going to be naturally good at that. We are here to transfer a ton of content to your brain, and hopefully you'll make sense of it all through your own reflection, right? It's kind of, it feels a lot like Tom, you're using a sports analogy earlier. I feel like it feels a lot like when sports science wasn't very advanced. We just go, well, just go run a ton and then you'll be fast. And then later on we realize, hold on a minute, it turns out there's nutrition, there's sleep, there's strength, there's agility, there's a lot more nuance that we should be thinking about, right? And so yes, you still have to run, to get fast. You can't ignore that, but there's a lot of other things that we do, and we can
Yeah.
do it smarter.
Jeff, I love running. You actually hit a passion of mine. And I think it's a great example because maybe humans find reflection naturally. Humans are also built to run, right? Like if you look at the history of humanity, humans are actually elite long distance runners evolutionarily, right? Like, but you have to practice it, right? If you don't use that skill, you lose it. And so, are we built to reflect? I think we are, but you still have to do it intentionally and thoughtfully and strategically and in a sustained way to make it valuable.
Right. Well, you can almost train yourself out of it if we don't put value on it. That's
Yes.
a danger to humanity, right? I feel like there's a certain aspect of, when we don't train ourselves to become reflective thinkers, that's when we become easily manipulated by others, easily not being able to tell, truth from things that are not true, um, because we're not exercising that part of the brain,
Right.
um, and that's a um, that's a dangerous path to go down. And if we only count on people to just do it naturally, they'll still do some of it. But especially if we keep telling people that doesn't matter, you just need to learn this. Then they go, well, hold on a minute. Turns out, even though I'm naturally good at it, not gonna do anything with it. That's that's a serious problem. Now I know that at University of Arizona, as part of what you've done in this reform, and actually, Devon, in your course, it's called University 301, and it's about building portfolios. And I've been so lucky to have been involved with you all to do your portfolio work, but we just took a small part of it because you use the platform to do the work that you do, but a big part of what I've been really always been so um, enamored by is your um, dedication to making a learning portfolio. Um, can you maybe talk about why portfolio and what is a learning portfolio versus any other types of portfolio, and maybe so that people can get a little bit of a color of like, well, what does it mean when they have gone through Unif 101 and then they took some other class, they come to my 301 class and they do this portfolio. Why? And what does that look like? What does it actually look like for a student? Are they just basically writing a lot more paper, or are they not writing a lot more
Yeah.
paper? What does this mean? Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks, Jeff. What I think is particularly exciting, and when I think about what makes a learning portfolio stand apart from what we consider maybe more external facing or showcase portfolios, career portfolios. There's many different kinds of portfolios and they all serve different purposes. And I had a colleague once kind of frame this well for me, as the primary audience member of a learning portfolio is the student. And that resonates with us. And so much of what we're trying to do is that the primary audience and the main stakeholder in students' learning and their degree is the student. So that is where the effort and the work and really the learning happens, is that when a student gets a chance to say, this is actually what I've learned, this is what's mattered to me, and this is what it's going to mean for me moving forward, and really almost in dialogue with themselves, right, their past self, and their learning. That is quite a profound responsibility, and then gives us a sense of, okay, now I can actually talk about and see the connections that maybe I didn't see before, in my undergraduate career. So I think and that was a mindset shift too for me professionally, right? And it's something we still like when Tom and I meet with folks around campus, and we have our little, song and dance we do about the classes. That's a big myth we have to debunk, is what this portfolio is, and that there's value when, and particularly for some fields and industries and for some degree programs, right? Having an external portfolio is a requirement and an expectation for their industry or their career. And that's not to say that like you can't have more than one, right? Or you wouldn't have more than one portfolio as a part of your undergraduate experience. That would be, if we were to think about, we would never tell a student to have only one version of their resume or to complete one final exam for their entire undergraduate degree. Like that would just serve no purpose and it has no applicability. But rather with the learning e-portfolio, it's responsive to, again, the call that we are responding to with students, that I want to be able to say I know what I learned and what value it has to offer for my general education. And that's what they're prompted to do as a part of this portfolio experience. And sometimes what they decide to include may not be the things that their general education instructor necessarily set out for them as a part of the assignment. Sometimes the learning that they uncover through the reflective process is not necessarily what the assignment was designed to do. And I think that is an important and profound insight when you realize something from a learning experience that maybe you didn't expect to find, is one of, I think, the key pieces of a learning portfolio that you wouldn't necessarily put out into the world, especially if it was something like, wow, I learned that my team really struggled because of our time management, right? Like I wouldn't put that on my LinkedIn necessarily, but that would be important for me to understand, and then to be able to say, next time I work on a team, I know I got to bring these skills to that team project. So maybe that was a long answer, but it's an exciting opportunity
No,
for
I think
students to really get to say, this is what I learned and this is what matters to me. And here's how I'm going to apply that learning in my future.
And I think part of that, that Devon was alluding to, is this idea of like using a learning e-portfolio as a space where you can also showcase failure. And when we're talking about students who are so often so failure averse, right? Like not ever wanting to kind of put under a microscope the things that they haven't done well, having this space where they can say, wow, I went back and here's a paper I wrote 2 years ago in my first year. And actually, this is not a very good example of critical thinking, but this is what I've learned since then through these other experiences. Like, that is so powerful for students to be able to more intentionally think about um, the things that they maybe haven't done as well as they wanted to, because that's also a part of learning, right? Is being able to learn from failure.
I mean, going back to your football game analogy, unless you won every single one of those games, there will be some failures, and that's where you're gonna have to learn and figure out how to do, better next time. And one of the things that I that that is really um, part of the inception of Digication as a platform, for portfolios. It's called Make Learning Visible. But a lot of people don't realize that when we say make learning visible, is to make learning visible first and foremost to yourself. Um, because that is what powers the rest of, how do you grow from that to, potentially, like you said, making it visible for a potential employer or what have you. And you can edit and you can curate and you can do a version of it that you make visible for them that's appropriate. That's just being able to understand audience. That's a simple thing to do. But the idea that we get to just see it for ourselves, it almost feels like you should be able to do it, except that we don't, right? So if Tom, I'm going to go back to your football VHS tape. If no one taped it, right? If no one taped it and no one on Monday said, let's sit and watch how we got our butt kicked.
That was
If
usually the
no one
case.
forced you to, right. But if no one forced you to do it, no one taped it, no one bothered with it because we didn't care that much, right? Then on Monday, you have missed one of the most valuable ways to grow, right? You would have just go, well, we got our butt kicked. I'm not sure why. Everyone, just go run another 10 laps.
you, you, I'm going to push back on that a little bit. I think because there's two things that you mentioned that are important for the reflection to happen. One is that somebody videotaped it, and two is that somebody said, let's think about this and think about what happened. I think the videotape is helpful, but it's not a necessary condition, right? The necessary condition is that you make time for it, right? That somebody says,
Mm,
sit down and think about it, because a lot of reflection happens without an artifact. I mean, our e-portfolios have artifacts, right? But if you develop the habits and skills of reflection, you can do that without necessarily having an artifact, but just thinking about your experience. So, I mean, I do a lot of running, and after I run a race, I mean, I'm not racing competitively, believe me, but after I run a race, I don't have a videotape of that race, but I can still think about, like, okay, how did I manage my nutrition? What was my mental state? How did training go leading up
mm.
to that? I don't necessarily have to have an artifact in order for reflection to happen. The necessary condition is that you make time for it.
Yes.
Just make the time and being deliberate about, like, hey, I'm gonna actually think about something that would have been painful in particular
Yep.
sometimes, right? Like it didn't go well. What happened? Like I have to realize that.
Yeah. And I think that's what distinguishes a learning portfolio from, say, a cloud storage device, right? Or a Google
Mm,
Drive, right? Is that students are oftentimes prompted, or sometimes are incentivized on their own to maybe save their work, or they have whatever versions of their
right.
past English papers. But in life, right, as competing priorities happen, we document, we submit the work, and then we move on to the next task, right? And that is often what is also incentivized, right, in higher education. Submit the work, I evaluate it, I determine that you learned the things I was looking for you to do. And what actually makes it a learning, the visibility part, right, the learning portfolio, is that now I actually have to go back and think about this paper, maybe revisit it again, think about maybe what were the conditions I was writing this paper in, right? And actually maybe the things I got out of it, and to reflect in that capacity. That is something that you wouldn't necessarily be prompted to engage with if you're just, here I am with my drive and my cloud device and moving on.
Right. It's kind of like a 1-2 punch. You can have the experience, but if you don't get to process that experience afterwards, it just sits alone as an experience, and it did something, but it didn't do its full potential. Like to really, you didn't really get most out of it. You got the first half. You got the experience, but that experience did not mean as much as if you had been able to actually take the time to process it and to make meaning out of it and to make connections in this experiences comparing to other experiences that you also have and layer them. Um, how do you think? Let me ask you a little bit about now that you've done this for. I mean, look, you and like you said, your colleagues have done this for many years, but now it's really brought to the forefront to a massive scale to thousands of students per year. Can we talk a little bit about, so what's the outcome of this? Like what are students getting out of it, and have you seen evidence of it? Like I think it must be so cool, Devon, for you to teach the the bookend, the other end of the bookend class, where you go, well, these students coming out of courses directed by Tom, do they come into your class being more reflective, and how so does it show?
Yeah, I think what's been one of the most, I don't know, unexpected benefits, right? Particularly with teaching 301. One of the first kind of reflection questions students are asked in the first week of the class is, what's been kind of the most meaningful general education class you've taken to date, and why? Like, why was it meaningful? What did you get out of it? And overwhelmingly, there's many answers to that question. Students can choose whatever class they want, but seems to be the most popular answer is, it was my intro to gen ed class, my Univ 101 class.
Hmm.
And usually the answer is, I didn't see the value at the time, right? I didn't see the purpose. And actually now I understand, right? I learned like how to learn, right? I learned the value of reflection. They point to all these different things that they got out of the class that at the time they might not have seen or really cared much about, because it's their first semester. There's so many things happening in your life when you're starting a new program, and that's a pretty profound insight, and I think quite powerful, that we don't see otherwise oftentimes as faculty and instructors when we teach a one-off class. We see the students, we interact with them for a certain period of time, and then we hope that the messages that we hope to relay go with them and show up somewhere else. But it's not often we actually get to see that learning actualized in real time or some time afterwards. And I think that that's one of the most exciting things that I find, is that students see the value, and they just might not actually see it in the moment. They're starting to recognize it later. And so that's not to say every student, right, comes to that realization, and even sometimes they point about the zombies class, or what, pyramids and mummies, and they can talk about, oh, like, this is why I got this out of this class. And again, as faculty members, I don't teach that class, but now I can tell, that faculty member, students are talking about your class, and here's what they're learning about it. And if it's through their reflections or it's in their e-portfolio, that opportunity to engage with that work, I think is something that is often missing. It's quite a missed opportunity, and something that we're really excited to kind of weave for students in their undergraduate experience.
And by how we defined it earlier, that these things are durable and transferable, I bet you that if you were to ask that same thing again, 10 years down the road, I know it's hard to have these I wish that we can just like do that, right? But if you were able to ask like 10, 20 years down the road, it would have been even more pronounced. It would be more pronounced that the student go, I went to college because I learned how to think. And I forgot and altogether what some of the content that I did, but I learned how to think and I learned how to solve problems. I learned how to reflect. I
Yeah.
learned how to use these skills. And I think that's, probably the even bigger and better proof that it's hard for us to do. But, I bet you that that's the case. Tom, you must be pretty proud when people say, hey, Univ 101, that was it. That was the moment.
Do you know it? Sure. Yeah. I mean, it makes me proud. I think there's one anecdote in particular that I think I always go back to, and it speaks to your question about our students better at reflecting. And it was the first year that we were launching the new program. Now, only new students are going to be in this new program, so we still have to teach out our existing students in the old general education curriculum. And we had a gen ed instructor teaching one of our exploring perspective classes reach out to our instructional support team and say, wow, I have all of these students in the new gen ed program. They're so prepared to do the reflection in my class. Do you have any strategies I can give to the students in the old gen ed program to help them catch up? Because they're not reflecting at the same level as the students who have gone through this class that has actually systematically engaged them in the habits and skills of reflection. And I think that piece of evidence, right, anecdotal as it is something that I point to because it's very clear. Students might not see it in the moment, they might not see the value of it in the moment, but just the act of doing it every week for an entire semester, right? It's it's like if you go for a long walk every day, you might not notice that you're getting stronger, but like you're getting stronger. And we do see it in their work, which is, I think, really that's the exciting part for me, is that we can see the actual growth and how they're thinking.
And I've heard similar sentiments from other people. And actually, there's even one additional piece, which is, but as far as the content, sometimes that's completely gone. Even by the second semester, like students don't even remember what they read about or what that was all about. But it didn't matter because that wasn't the point,
No.
right? The point of it was, no, we want you to exercise that part of your brain muscle, which
Yes.
is how do you reflect, how do you solve problem based on these, like how do you come up with bigger, newer questions,
Yes.
how do you come up with visions of the world, and these are the reflection becomes the basic building block of
Yes.
how you answer all of these things.
Can I tell my C++ story, Devon?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, but this is my favorite thing. I had to take a computer programming class as an undergraduate, Jeff. I
Yep.
hated it. Absolutely hated it. I have had no
Yeah.
intention of being a computer programmer. This is 25 plus years ago, right? It's a long time ago. I had to learn C++, never used it since. 2 years ago when I wrote about this story, I had to like Google C++. I'm like, is this even the language anymore? I don't even know if people still use this. It is. I've never used it. But I will tell you, when I sit down to an Excel spreadsheet and I write like super complicated formulas and people are like, how did you learn to do that? I've never taken a class in Excel. I took a class in C++ 25 years ago. It taught me how to think like a programmer. It taught me about computer syntax, about computer language, about thinking about punctuation in that. And so now I can write really complicated formulas in Excel, not because I took an Excel class, but because I learned how to think like a computer programmer 25 years ago. And that to me is the power of general education, right? Like you learn this way of thinking. The content doesn't matter. In most fields, if they're doing their job, the content's going to be uh, irrelevant in 15, 20 years, right? But it's the way of thinking, right? Like I learned to think in this way, and that thinking is where all the value is.
It's so crystallized in sort of where you stand in the pedagogy, and that you are so willing to put all that into practice and in scale. So it's not, I mean, I think I've seen in a lot of institutions, they're like, well, we experiment with this one little group, and it does well. But then there's always a but probably because of that smaller group of people, because they were in this college and they naturally do better. There's always some excuse and why it wasn't going to work. And for University of Arizona to take on this kind of endeavor, this reform at this scale, at this level, and doing it so progressively, to be able to just go, we're going to really, make this part of this, and you are able to see the results like this. I am just so in awe, and I feel like there are a lot of institutions. Well, hopefully, if there any of them are listening, they're probably thinking about, well, we are going through our own reform, our own sort of refresh. We also have our Gen Ed program for 25 years, and we hadn't done anything, and we've been talking about it. Um, I hope that they can see what you all have done, and and store that as a source of hope that could happen for them too. And I really think that it's, I just came back from well, I didn't just come back. I came back, I went to a Gen Ed conference in October, and I feel like there were, you know, folks that are on the other side of before the reform or during the reform, or the trying to get a reform going. Um, Sometimes they feel like this is never going to happen because faculty senate wasn't going to let us, or um, actually, you mentioned earlier a board of regents. In some programs in some states where certain things are banned, and they're having to do these kind of reforms with hands tied, and in very restrictive manners. It makes life very, very difficult. But I think that what you have done here serves as an amazing example of what can happen if you prioritize
Hmm.
it.
Yeah, I'll add that I think maintaining the focus on what's in the interest and response to students, right? The institutional support then makes it actualized, right? And that also the work that we're doing in 101 and 301, having a common first year seminar focused on general education, building a general education e-portfolio, like these don't exist in a vacuum. We operate on a campus that has tremendous, like, high impact practices and meaningful learning experiences for many different students, and I think that recognizing that work is also, like, this isn't the only e-portfolio a student creates, right? They're creating e-portfolios in other gen ed classes, right? And to recognize that experience and to see that as, well, this is a tremendous opportunity because now students are getting practice with this way of thinking and engaging in their learning, so that it isn't the first time that they're doing something, because we know that then that kind of practice makes it more easier to recall. It makes then the depth of their work more robust, right? And I think that also then makes it feel like everyone has a seat at the table, everyone's work can be valued, and that students can engage in multiple experiences that are meaningful and we know contribute to ultimately their learning and their success here. And I think that then makes it feel like there's more opportunities to collaborate, to get buy-in, and to make the work more sustainable. So, I think that that's an opportunity to look for as well, because one solution isn't going to work for everybody. There's many different possibilities, and good work that's happening. It's just, how do you recognize that work and amplify it so more students can get connected?
I want to. Can I plug something for you, Devon?
Sure.
I know that you and a number of your colleagues had published an article in at the International Journal of ePortfolio. Article is named "Connecting the Dots: Utilizing Learning Portfolio in a Large-Scale General Education Curriculum," and I I find it to be an incredible article. One of the things that I really love is that you said learning portfolio can act as a constellation, the work of connecting the dots. And I just think that's so beautiful because stars themselves, each individual star means something. It's cool, but it's the constellation that makes meaning, and I just love that. I think that's such a beautiful and poetic um, illustration of the work that you're doing. Congratulations on
Thanks.
that.
Yes. Yeah, it was exciting to realize and document even for ourselves, right? And being able to share that work and the tremendous effort of many of our colleagues on this campus and where we're headed. So thanks.
Well, you're practicing what you preach. You're making your own work visible first to yourself, but now to the world. I think that's lovely. Well, hey, listen, I am such a big fan of both of you, and I hope you all continue this amazing work at University of Arizona. I hope that we get to touch base again. Maybe in a few years, we can be like, hey, now we've grown in these other directions as well. And maybe we can have that, like, hey, we actually did go and talk to some students after they graduate, and they say University 101 is still the bomb, right?
I hope so, Jeff.
Yeah. All right. Thank you both again for joining us today. For listeners, if you want to learn more about Devon and Thomas's work, I will be posting some links to their the general education program. I'll post links to that article that I just talked about, and any other links if you guys want to share, we'll include those as well. But thank you again so much for being a leader in this and doing such meaningful things, especially at this kind of scale. It takes real courage and effort and the hard work you put in there, is really showing. And I think that literally many tens of thousands of students are going to benefit from this, and this is really one of the most exciting things that I see in higher education. So really appreciate everything that you've done.
Thank
Great.
you.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Okay, take care.
Coming up next, we'll be chatting with Whitney Fountain Ruiz, a recent graduate of Arizona State University. Here's a quick preview.
I did try to get him into it, but I wanted him to understand it is okay to make mistakes. But if you make a mistake, you can also ask questions until you get help or find the answer that you're looking for.